Hi everyone, my name's John Downing and I'm a limnologist and aquatic ecologist. I also work in biogeochemistry and a fair number of other different fields. I have taught aquatic ecology and limnology for a lot of years, and I have created this set of so far 28 different sessions to try to make learning in the aquatic sciences accessible to everyone. This set of lectures works rather well with the ebook by Calvin Downing that's available on Amazon, um, and easy to find. Here's what it looks like, and not terribly expensive to purchase. So today in session 20, we'll be talking about wetland plant communities and classifications. These are very vegetated systems, very shallow water systems that you may be familiar with. You may know some things already about wetlands. These are water bodies that don't have a lot of open water like a lake. You may have walked across them when they're frozen. You may have walked through them and played around them as a child. Some of the common names you probably used for them are things like swamp, bog, and marsh. In general, I like to call them wetlands. And as I said, if you were an outdoorsy kind of kid, you probably played around them because they're really active biologically. Lots of frogs and other kinds of living things. They're teeming with life. Teeming with life basically because productivity is almost unlimited in a wetland system because there's a lot of water, there's a lot of nutrient, and a lot of light. What I'd like to do in this particular session is talk about the sort of the general classification and variation in wetland communities. So my objectives for you would be that you'd learn the factors influencing the biogeography of vegetation. You'd learn where wetlands are found and what they're called, different names for those wetlands. Also, I'd like us to examine differences between coastal and inland wetland abundance, look at where in the world and where in North America wetlands are, and I'd like to have us discuss the characteristics of 9 important wetland plant communities, have a look at some of these plants and see how the wetlands differ in terms of vegetation, and then I'd like us to learn together about wetland classification types, of which there are many, and actually determining classifications of where there are and where there are not wetlands is an important area of work. So wetland classification training, although we won't go into it in great detail in this session, it's a great area to work in, especially for people who like to be outdoors and do something helpful with respect to property classification and taxation and a variety of things like that. So in order to understand where the different kinds of wetlands exist, you have to think about them, just vegetation types in general, because embedded within each of the vegetation types in North America and elsewhere, there are wetlands, and those wetlands are rather distinct depending on what kind of vegetation is able to grow there. Here you see this sort of patchwork of vegetation across North America with boreal forest in the northern part here, northern U.S. and Canada, tundra vegetation up here in the very cold regions of North America. We have deciduous forests here covering a lot of, or originally covering a lot of eastern North America, dry grassland sorts of areas here, more sort of desert shrub kinds of communities here, and so on. Now, the reason those different vegetation communities exist like that is no accident. This patchwork is a little bit hard to track, but you can array all these vegetation types on a really simple graph, like this one shown here, where they tend to line up nicely, the different vegetation types, with across a gradient of mean annual temperature. Here in this graph, the cold temperature is at the top, just to warn you. These graphs are very popular, and there are different ways of looking at them. Sorry, this is mean annual temperature here, cold at the top, warm at the bottom, and mean annual precipitation with very wet um, wet terrain out in here where you find the tropical evergreen forest. So generally, the temperate deciduous forest here is sort of in the center, moderate. That would be what temperate means. Get colder, you get into boreal forests and tundra. Over here would be woodland, shrubland, and grasslands. Cold deserts here where precipitation is really low, and the temperature is cool, and hot desert here where temperature is warm, and so on. Temperature and precipitation really drive the kind of vegetation you find in a place, and therefore they drive those two variables have a lot to do with where you find wetlands. Now, clearly, wetlands are going to be much more common where we have more water, because it's hard to have wet land if you, in fact, have not very much water. Although there are some types of temporary wetlands that show up in very xeric environments. So basically, in this biome model, we will have different kinds of wetlands embedded throughout these different types of vegetation. So we might ask ourselves where in the world the wetlands are. Wetland communities are essentially a subtype within each biome, and precipitation and temperature are the major environmental gradients driving those wetland communities. But there are additional factors that influence the development of aquatic communities, and those would be things like topography and hydrologic patterns. And the hydrologic patterns can be seasonal, and they can be long-term, and clearly they can be involved in, they can be changing over time as well, as we see in almost everywhere on the planet today. So this map shows in various colors the kinds of where the wetlands are found in the world, and the green would be upland wetlands, the blue would be lowland or very low-lying wetlands. The yellow is organic wetlands, and these would be often peatlands that are, and you'll see that they are often in very northern climates. And then where you see the red markings on this plot, on this graph map, the red is basically salt-affected systems, and these are often areas where water runs in and doesn't run out, basically evaporates, leaving behind salt deposits extracted from the soil, or simply carried in small concentrations that build up into high concentrations over time. The light blue would be the inland water bodies, things like lakes, and you can see, I think, if you look carefully, the Great Lakes, the speckling of light blue across Canada and Scandinavia and various other places in the world. So here's nomenclature means names of things, and here are some names for wetlands. Swamps are generally dominated by woody vegetation. Marshes, which you've probably heard that word, marsh, is generally dominated by herbaceous vegetation, so not woody vegetation. These would be grasses and sedges and other things, as we'll see in a bit. And then there are all kinds of locally derived names. Where I grew up, we often called them sloughs. Other places we called them quagmires. Down in the south in Louisiana, some call them bayous. In England, they'll be called moors. And then peatlands are, as I said, are distributed across northern climates. So one of the things I wanted us to look at was where in the world the coastal wetlands are, and this would be pretty specific to North America. I apologize to you, any of you who are from elsewhere. If you're thinking of coastal wetlands, they come in a series of different types. They can be salty, they can be fresh, or brackish water, or they can be mangrove systems. Now, the coastal wetlands make up something like 3.2 million hectares, so they're very abundant, and as I said before, very, very productive. The Gulf of Mexico has a phenomenal amount of wetland and those bayou systems, and because it's fairly low-lying terrain around the Gulf of Mexico, There's a lot of coastal wetland in that area, but not so shabby in the Atlantic. Pacific coast, very little because the terrain is so precipitous, and likewise for Alaskan wetlands, very little because it's very rocky. There are sort of fjord systems, but those would not be classified as wetlands. So something like a total overall. Oh, and I should mention the mangroves, but we'll look at those in a little bit more detail in just a little bit. So a total of about 3.2 million hectares of coastal wetlands. If you think about inland wetlands, again, these are in the same numbers. The lower 48 states of the United States have something like 39 million hectares of peatlands, marshes, and swamps. Alaska has a terrific amount. Alaska alone has almost double the wetland of the lower 48 states, for a total of something like 107 million hectares of inland wetlands. So in general, although the coastal wetlands are very important in their own right, there are probably more inland wetlands in North America than there are coastal wetlands. In North America, there are several different kinds of wetland plant communities, and this doesn't include everything, but these are some of the major and important ones. What I'd like us to do is look at some pictures of these and talk about the different kinds of vegetation that are in these different kinds of wetland plant communities. And they are coastal salt marsh, sort of estuarine systems. There are bogs, pocossins, which are fairly localized, Everglades, which are very famous, cypress swamps, mangrove swamps, playa lakes, which would be much more xeric or very dry systems. And then there's this massive prairie pothole region in the middle of North America. And then speckled throughout the geography are fens, and they all have their own particular characteristics and vegetation. So here's some images of coastal marshes, and I suspect many of you have actually seen these. You may live around them. They are brackish or saline systems, and they are often very grassy and vegetated. The word marsh, of course, as opposed to swamp, means they are more herbaceous in character. So the defining characteristics of coastal marshes are obviously that they occur at the interface of fresh and salt water, and their hydrology is often associated with a river outlet into the sea and in some kind of deltaic system, and they tend to be affected by river flow and tides both. And I think in the previous image, and probably you can see the tidal marks in this upper this is probably low tide or a descending tide, or you can see that there's quite a bit of exposed soil. They're tidal systems oftentimes. Their water chemistry tends to be brackish. Now, brackish means of intermediate salinity, somewhere between seawater and freshwater. And their soils tend to be very mineral, often with high organic content. And that high organic content just comes about because there's really a lot of productivity there, and the organic matter falls to the soil and decomposes, but is not completely washed away. The vegetation tends to be dominated by things like spartina, by rushes, by sedges, other kinds of sort of grassy vegetation that you see in coastal marshes. So those are the defining characteristics of coastal marshes. Another system, for those of you who may live somewhere near where I work, another kind of system would be a bog. There are lots of different kinds of bogs, but bogs tend to have really high organic matter in their water. Here's some pictures of a floating bog. This is a floating sphagnum bog. Here's a sphagnum a shelf basically floating out over the water. If you walk on them, you basically keep your arms out in case you pile through them. Here's a black spruce bog, very common in northern Minnesota and some of the other Great Lakes states. And here's a tamarack bog with very slow-growing, deciduous coniferous trees. The tamarack And some of their characteristics are that they tend to be distributed in northern forests, so boreal forests as well as some of the deciduous forests of North America, for example. Their hydrology can be really variable. They're often associated with lakes and streams and closed basins, very slow moving, not a lot of physical activity. And their water chemistry tends to be highly acidic, and it's highly acidic because it's driven by organic acids that are essentially leached out of the vegetation that's floating in the bog. They'll tend to be very brown water, and these bogs are well known for doing some terrific things, like if you throw organic matter into them of varying kinds, because of their high acidic content and the amount of tannin that's in there. Let's say you throw, I don't know, a human being, as has happened in the past in Denmark and other places. They sometimes got rid of criminals by tossing them into bogs, and those their bodies would be almost perfectly preserved, basically tanned for a long period of time because of that water chemistry. Soils are very organic, if they can be really called soils at all. They tend to be basically 80 to 100% organic matter. The vegetation, of course, there are different kinds of bogs. We talked about a black spruce bog. Clearly, there's a lot of black spruce, sphagnum, tamarack. There oftentimes are orchids, different kinds of orchids and carnivorous plants. The bogs tend to be pretty buggy, lots of insects, and so some of the vegetation that's evolved there would be, or have grown there, would be the carnivorous plants, such as the sundew and the pitcher plant on the right, where the insects will crawl in and then basically be digested by the plant, and that's used as a source of nutrient material. Another kind of wetland community that I really am not terribly familiar with, these would be southern bogs. These are pococyns, and they occur in the Atlantic coastal plain, with about 3/4 of them in the state of North Carolina. So they're pretty localized, but fairly well known southern bogs. Pococyns are basically, a pococyn is a swamp on a hill, so they tend to be really isolated systems. Their hydrology is that they receive all or most of their water from precipitation. Their water chemistry, because they are considered bog-like, is acidic, and again, that's due to the leaching of organic acids, organic material out of dissolved organic matter into the water. Their soils tend to be obviously organic, and the vegetation can be a mixture of all kinds of things, evergreen trees like pond pine, the loblolly, red bay, sweet bay, broadleaved evergreen shrubs, including a whole bunch of interesting things like the wax myrtle, the leatherleaf, and gallberries. Great deal of interesting vegetation in these very localized pococyn or swamp on a hill, bog on a hill kind of systems. Another one that we really need to talk about because it's so famous would be the Everglades, which we sometimes think of as a river of grass. Basically, the Everglades flow from the middle part of Florida down through the state of Florida and out through the southern tip of Florida, essentially, if it's undisturbed. Everglades are found here in the middle of Florida. As I said before, there are some preserves, but also some major threats to the existence of the Everglades. As you can see here, a lot of, on the right-hand side of your screen, a lot of development, farms and so on, encroachment of cities and so on. But this whole system is actually flowing water down this way toward the southern tip of Florida. The Everglades, the defining characteristics of the Everglades, clearly they occur in South Florida. Their hydrology is basically dominated by precipitation and runoff, and this flow of water from the middle portion of Florida to the southern. Water chemistry is fresh. They are not, because the flow is from precipitation and runoff, they are not brackish. Vegetation is dominated by sawgrass and a variety of other really interesting kinds of vegetation within the Everglades. Cypress swamps, a little bit north. Here we use the word swamp, right, because it is in fact dominated by very woody vegetation. The cypress are really interesting trees. They keep their roots down underwater, and because they're underwater and that's a very oxygen poor system, they will have little knees sticking up here, ways for them to pull in air so that they can use that oxygen in order to keep the root systems working appropriately. Cypress swamps, clearly, they occur in the southeast U.S. Their hydrology is associated with river systems, oftentimes very slow-moving systems. They tend to be closed basins, and those closed basins are called cypress domes. Water chemistry is fresh, albeit often black water, again very dark because of the fixation of organic matter, the leaching of dissolved organic matter in their soils, again tend to be very organic. And vegetation would be the bald cypress. It really only grows in those sorts of warm environments. Next set of systems that I want to talk about would be the mangrove swamps. Mangroves come in a variety of different types, and they are almost all coastal systems. If you ever get the chance to go snorkeling around a mangrove swamp, you should do it. They're extraordinarily rich in wildlife, as you can see in this image. Mangrove swamps look like this when you're inside of them. They have prop roots holding the plants up out of the water. They're often reticulate with little channels that are just teeming with a variety of different kinds of life. They also tend to hang on to soil so that they protect coasts. In Hurricane Maria a little bit ago, a lot of the swamps, the mangroves were torn out by the hurricane, and that meant that the rates of erosion and destruction of coastal resources increased remarkably. So mangrove swamps, they occur in tropical and subtropical coastal areas. They're often, again, associated with river outlets, supplies of nutrient coming into marine systems. They're affected both by river flow and tides. Water chemistry is brackish, varying from highly saline to relatively fresh. The soils are mineral, that is to say the rate of decomposition is high, so organic matter is removed. The vegetation is dominated by 4 different species of mangroves. The black mangrove, the red, the white, and the sweet mangrove. And they all function similarly, although they have very different growth forms. And next we can talk about some of the endorheic sorts of wetlands, and these would be playa lakes. And these look a lot like lakes, but you can pick them out pretty easily because they often have a sprinkling of salt or crusts of salt around the outside. These playa lakes tend to be, as I said, endorheic, meaning the rivers run into them and don't run out of them. And one of the reasons that they become saline is because of the evaporation of water, leaving behind the salts that have been dissolved by the flow of water, and then leaving behind. And by the way, that salinity isn't identical to marine salinity. It tends to be dominated by very different kinds of ions. Often sulfur figures prominently, and calcium and magnesium instead of sodium, and so on. But these playa lakes are found clearly in arid regions, and they're very important in those areas. Now, these will tend to be very, very seasonal. That is to say, rainy season they exist, and then they simply dry up and disappear. But the life will come teeming back into them just very rapidly after water's added to them. I grew up around some sorts of playa lakes or similar ones in North Dakota, And if you get in that area of the world, you can see these endorheic systems that are very, very crusty and salty, um, and then teeming with life when there is water added to them. Playas are distributed through arid and semi-arid regions. Their hydrology is that they receive water from precipitation and local runoff, and there are just huge annual water level fluctuations. Water chemistry tends to be saline, but very rich in a variety of different kinds of ions. Soils are mineral, vegetation is sparse, and it's salt-adapted vegetation, vegetation that can exist under fairly harsh conditions, not the same kind of saline conditions as you find in the coastal marsh, for example, but salt or high salinity adapted vegetation. Another super important kind of wetland that we find in North America will be prairie potholes. Actually, you'll find the prairie potholes in around Scandinavia and various other places if you have a gradient between a glaciated environment and a more xeric or drier kind of environment. They tend to be, well, they look very much like this little system to the upper left. You see cattails and sedges and grasses around them. They're very important for the production of waterfowl. They are rich in bird life and animal life, again, because they're super high productivity. The prairie pothole region of North America is distributed from basically central Iowa, following the glaciated region, this sort of edge of the last glaciation. But the prairie pothole region stretches up into Alberta from Iowa, covers a lot of South Dakota and North Dakota, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and just a little bit of Montana. Very productive. The prairie potholes' defining characteristics are that they're of recent glacial origins. They tend to be closed basins. These are not flow-through systems, but ones that collect water. But their hydrology is that they receive water from precipitation, local runoff, and groundwater, and the combination of different water sources keep them fresh. Also, the lack of severe evaporation keeps the water fresher, although I have been in areas where I've seen, even within a few kilometers of one another, depending on the topography, you'll find fresh water and also saline water pothole wetlands. Water chemistry tends to run to the fresh. The soils tend to be mineralized. Mineral meaning that there is decomposition that loses carbon, but they often do have fairly high organic content. Vegetation is extremely variable and again depends on salinity, temperature, precipitation, where along that gradient they exist. The next type of wetland that I want to talk about would be a fen. A fen are fairly special little wetlands that their hydrology is that they're dependent on groundwater rather than precipitation. So because of this, they tend to be really mineral rich. The water chemistry tends to be alkaline because there is a lot of alkalinity brought in, that is to say calcium, magnesium carbonates. Soils tend to be organic because there's really no flow through. And their vegetation is really similar to freshwater marshes. But there are some unique indicator species, and these would be things like arrowgrass, lobelia, and Parnassus palustris. These can be fairly diagnostic of a fen ecosystem. Next thing I want to talk about briefly in this session is wetland classification. And you might ask, why bother classifying wetlands? Who cares what kind they are? Or if they are actually a wetland, or if they're just soggy ground. A lot of this has to do with legal issues and policy issues that generally during the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, there was a tendency to destroy wetlands, basically drain them and turn them into dry land. And it was found that this was really pretty dangerous. for the general environment in a variety of areas. There are places in North America that have actually lost 90% of their wetland structure. So in order to protect wetlands with legal means, one has to actually know where they are, and what kind of wetland they are depends and will determine the kind of protection they receive. In some places, taxation and wetland property can't be taxed for property taxes, and that makes a really big difference to the people who own those wetlands. Also, permitting. In areas, if people say they'd like to build a new structure someplace, it's important to know whether there's wetland, if there are wetlands that are going to be interfered with. And also, it's important to classify wetlands for mitigation. Sometimes in bridge construction, road construction, you simply can't avoid destroying a wetland, and there are legal rules that indicate when you need to mitigate. That is to say, build a new wetland where one existed, in an area where one existed before. So you really need to know what kind of wetland it was. You also know when you've succeeded at creating that new wetland to mitigate a wetland that was unfortunately in the wrong place. And oftentimes these mitigations will be 2 to 1, 3 to 1, that you have to build more wetland than you actually destroy. I've seen arguments made that golf courses are strategic or important resources, and sometimes they will destroy wetlands. And then the process is that a lot of wetland classification goes on. People determine what kind of wetland there was there, and how much there was that was a legal wetland, and then the onus will be on the person destroying that wetland and to create somewhere nearby as much wetland or more than they have destroyed. And then there are scientists who go out and figure out if they actually have created such a wetland. So wetland classification is an important area. It also can be kind of mysterious, but some of the schemes are pretty straightforward. So the criteria used for classification in general would be obviously the presence of water, but then also the vegetation that's there. And some of the vegetation that you will find in a particular kind of wetland can exist in a lot of places. But there is some vegetation that absolutely requires a wetland environment in order to exist. So they're obliged to have exist in a wetland or facultative wetland species. And other things happen in the soils. If the soils are perpetually wet or almost always wet, you create a kind of a sort of soil that's called hydric soil. And with some training, one can dig down into a soil profile and observe whether or not there is a hydric soil that will show some glaying or mottling that indicates that it's perpetually wet or wet very frequently. So it'd be presence of water, vegetation, the type that's there, the sort of soil that is created being a hydric soil. Now, there's a long history of wetland classification, and I will say that it has been a speckled history, sort of. There were early wetland inventories. You can see that 1954 being the first national wetland inventory in the United States. It's kind of late, but they'd already destroyed a fair bit of that wetland. And then there's some work by Sean Fradine in 1956 that also defined where there were wetlands in a sort of an inventory sense. And then there was a thing called Circular 39 that was created. That's probably even today one of the most popular kinds of wetland classification system. It consists of about 20 wetland types. It's based on vegetation, and the emphasis there in that Circular 39 publication was on waterfowl habitat, whether or not it was a potential waterfowl habitat, or And the shortcomings of that circular 39 approach is that dissimilar vegetation types get lumped together pretty frequently, and there is really no provision for substrate or water chemistry differences in that circular 39 approach. But just to give you a sense of what this looks like and what the classifications of the wetland types were within circular 39, they consisted of 8 different types of inland fresh areas, and these are really similar to those things that we talked about in the earlier part of the session. They'd be seasonally flooded basins or flats, so these are areas that are wet some of the time, but not all of the time. There are fresh meadows, shallow fresh marshes, deep fresh marshes, open fresh marshes, shrub swamps, wooded swamps, and bogs. Inland saline wetlands would be saline flats, saline marshes, and open saline water. And again, you know that if it's saline, then you know water's flowing in. It's probably not flowing out, and there's a high degree of evaporation wherever those saline systems exist. There are coastal fresh areas. These would be shallow fresh marshes, deep fresh marshes, and open fresh water. And continued on the next slide, we have coastal saline areas, which would be salt flats, pretty descriptive, salt meadows, a little bit higher vegetation, irregularly flooded salt marshes, regularly flooded salt marshes, sounds and bays, and mangrove swamps. So 20 different wetland types defined by the very famous and still frequently used circular 39 classification. Continuing sort of with the history of classification, there was a piece of work by Stewart and Kantrud in 1971, which was a regional system mostly created for the Prairie Pothole region of the middle part of North America. There were 7 types. They were based on water regime and chemistry, and the modifiers again were vegetation. That theme of vegetation, water inundation, amount of the year that flooding, and overall temperature and precipitation, again, is a repeated sort of theme. The Stewart and Kantrud system is summarized in a thing called Resource Publication 92. It identifies 7 different types, as I said before, and they would be ephemeral ponds, temporary ponds, seasonal ponds, and lakes. Here we have lakes being classified essentially as a wetland system, semi-permanent ponds and lakes, permanent ponds and lakes, alkali ponds and lakes, and again, alkali meaning that there's a lot of evaporation, and fen ponds, and we know what those are. Those would be where groundwater is pretty dominant. Now, I won't go deeply into these classifications, but these are just some diagrams showing that you can have within one system a variety of aspects, different zones within those 7 different classification types, and there can be for example, in a fen, a low prairie zone, a wet meadow zone surrounding the fen. In permanent open water zones, you'll have low prairie around the edge, and if you look at aerial photographs, you can see these very easily. Wet meadow zones, shallow marsh zones, and deep marshes, and then permanent open water. There also are, in alkali ponds and lakes, there often are fens that are fen zones that are feeding those alkali lakes, and so on. The present classification system was created by Coward and a series of co-workers. It is the national classification system that's mostly used now, and in the United States anyway. It's a hierarchical classification that's based on, again, hydrologic regime, substrate, and vegetation, but much more complex and hierarchical and I will show you this a little bit here. Here's an example of a classification hierarchy that we would start with. The hydrologic regime that would be driving it, the subsystem would be the local water regime. Then the class within that subsystem would be the kind of vegetation or the substrate, called physiognomy or physiography. Below that would be a subclass, a further refinement of that class, and then a dominance type, and that would be typology based on the dominant plant or animal community. Here are a couple, here's a kind of a great big difficult and I'm sure impossible to read in this video kind of classification, but just showing how these different habitats, there are systems, subsystems, and classes, and I'll choose just a couple of them. Here's lacustrine, which I like that best because I really like lakes. You can have under the system, it's a lacustrine system. You can have a subsystem that would be limnetic, having to do with the lake, or littoral, having to do with the fringing vegetation, and then within each one of those you'll have various classes. In the lacustrine littoral, there would be a class of rock bottom, aquatic beds, rocky shores, unconsolidated shore, and emergent wetland. So as a summary for this session, I'd just like to quickly summarize. Plant communities are structured in response to temperature and moisture, that is to say overall the plant communities, but embedded within those plant communities are wetlands, and they are found in each plant biome where topography and hydrology allow water to accumulate for any period of time. Coastal wetlands are less abundant than inland ones, but both coastal and inland wetlands are ecologically important. And we reviewed in this particular session a variety of different types of wetlands that are important in the United States in any case, and those would be salt marshes, bogs, Pocasins, Everglades, cypress swamps, mangrove swamps, playa lakes, prairie potholes, and fens. They're all important. Wetland communities in different areas. We talked briefly in this session about what distinguishes those wetlands one from the other. That would be region, hydrology, water chemistry, soils, and vegetation. Talked briefly about the Circular 39 wetland classification that's based on depth, permanence, salinity, and vegetation. Touched on the Carnivorous system of classification that's much more complex but more exacting in terms of typology. And just to summarize, wetlands are highly distinct and important ecosystems, highly productive, very biodiverse, and very active, really important in any environment, not just in North America, but across the planet.